Hi, Annette. Thank you for joining me for this very thought-provoking conversation. We know that family separation disproportionately impacts Black communities. We know that it disproportionately impacts brown communities, indigenous communities, whether that's through the carceral system, immigration, CPS, the family policing system. The collateral consequences of family separation show up in the lives of the parents, and they show up in the lives of the children. And I think that this trauma is intergenerational. So I'd like to talk to you today candidly about your experience and my experience with family separation, the carceral system, and how that's impacted us as well as our children.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. So I'll first start by saying that I have two children. I had my son when I was arrested, he was 5, and I had my daughter while I was incarcerated. And my mom had took my son and cared for him. But I will say that through the years of my incarceration, it was very difficult because there was not any programs geared toward keeping families together when I first entered the prison system back in '85. It wasn't until I would say 1990 that the institution that I was in started this weekend visitation programs for parents, and there was a criteria for that. You had to be minimum security, no tickets, no infractions, no segregation, in order to be able to spend a weekend with your child. This was an amazing program, all women, and it was like a campsite. So the children would come in on Fridays starting at noon, and they had to be out of the institution by Sunday by 5 o'clock. So this was the only opportunity for a weekend that mothers can spend and bond with their children. It was very, very helpful for me because my children were young. As I stated, my son was 5, and I had my daughter while I was incarcerated. So this one weekend out of a year allowed for me to have continuous relationship with my children.
Absolutely. And that's monumental, right? Especially when you compare it to having no contact to be able to spend with your children.
That is correct. The hardest thing for me was the fact that I was sentenced in the beginning to 75 years. So having a child while incarcerated and my son prior, that was the hardest thing for me, was who was going to care for my child or my children the entire time that I was there. How was the visitation going to work? Because I was in a completely different state than where my children was. So there had to be some form of transportation, which was hard because they had to travel like 5 hours, by bus, just to come for a 3-hour visit on the weekends, which was extremely hard for my kids.
Yes, I think that the environments inside of the correctional institutions, they don't breed relationship building. The visitation rooms, the way that the correctional officers treat us as well as our children and family members, they don't say this is nurturing, this is a place where you bond. Yeah. It's very surveillance, it's very militarized, and it's almost like everybody is on pins and needles, and we can't even talk about the things that really need to be addressed because we're trying to modify our behaviors. You can't have too much emotion. Nobody could scream, nobody could cry, nobody could get angry, which we know that these are all things that especially young children with incarcerated moms need to be able to go through in order to process what's happening to them healthily.
Yeah, and not only that, but visitation is another thing. You mentioned like the policing. So each child gets strip searched when they come visit their parents. So we're already at the door, we're setting them up for trauma exposure. One, they have to visit their mom. Not all visitation is personal where you can touch. Most visitation is behind a plexiglass. So the child cannot even touch their parents. And again, they get strip searched just like any other visitor come through. That's traumatizing. They don't sit and explain well, you have to go through a process called strip search. So a police is going to touch you. Imagine children that are coming from abusive homes, or they had some child molestation in their life, right? And then they come to an institution where they're forced to be strip searched at a young age. My kids were coming in when they were 6 and 7 years old. And so from the onset, I think, like, my son suffers the most. My daughter suffers a lot, just because she didn't have me growing up. My son had 5 years of me. And then it's the incarceration. And I'm removed from their life. There's barely phone calls while you're incarcerated because you have to rely on your family to put money on your books. So then there's the likelihood that you won't have a conversation with your child every day. My children are grown. They were grown when I was released. So trying to have a mother-daughter or mother-son relationship with them has been quite difficult because now they're grown. When they went in, they were children. And I come out and they're grown. And so I missed several opportunities in their life growing up. And those are years that I cannot get back. And those are years that they will not be able to get back either, from having to separate from me for so long.
Absolutely, absolutely. My story is a little different. I did less time in prison, but I was unable to have any contact with my children, right? And even leading up to incarceration, the places that I went to that I thought would help me, right? Like, I thought CPS helped parents and families that were struggling. I was a victim of domestic violence. I went through housing insecurity, food insecurity, and me going to HHSC, CPS, and being honest about these things actually just helped them build a case against me.
For sure.
And I got to see my children through visitations, through CPS prior to my incarceration, but that, quickly stopped. During my incarceration, I had no contact with them. And then after my incarceration, I tried to rebuild relationships with them, but it was very difficult. The person that had them did not want us to cultivate that relationship. And I spent a lot of money trying to enforce the rights that I did have. And I see the collateral consequences of family separation show up for me in ways that how I respond in relationships, my comfortability level, my trust with systems, my trust with other people. And I also see these things, the trauma responses, very evidently in my children.
Oh, for sure.
How is that for you?
Whew, that's a big one. Because I have been separated for like 20 years from my kids, I can see the slow development of my children and how it plays out even in my grandkids. My daughter, I had her while incarcerated. She's super reserved. She has a hard time like really communicating her feelings. And she's an adult with 2 girls. And it stems from not really having a close relationship with me, being able to be open and honest and talk about her feelings while I was incarcerated. I think that trickled over into her life as an adulthood. With my son, he's constantly in and out of the prison system. Even today, he's incarcerated. He experiences a lot of depression. He's very distrusting of the system and of people. So it's kind of like this push and pull with him. He's, got off into substance abuse because of my absence, and trying to reel him back in has been very difficult. So my kids, I think, suffer the most with my absence through like mental insecurities within themselves. And it's kind of hard, even as an adult with my daughter, to get her to open up because she's so used to being guarded all her life.
Right. So essentially, the long-term effects of the family separation have impacted our children in a tremendous way, and we could even say even in a more negative way than what it did to the adult that they were trying to punish.
For sure. The worst thing, I think, is family separation, because children, the first couple of years of their life is when the bonding really occurs. And so when you remove a child from his parents early on, you already implant separation anxiety with that child. For me, because I was gone so long and I wasn't able to see my kids on a regular basis, the communication is extremely hard with my children, to be able to say, okay, I'm out, I've been out for a long time, I'm here, let's communicate. It's extremely hard for them to do so. Because of that prominent bonding years of because I had my daughter inside. So you talked about CPS, right? The first thing they asked me was, did I want to adopt my child out? They didn't ask if I had family members that was able to come and pick up my child from the hospital, which I did. So the first thing the institution wanted me to do was sign some papers to give my child up. And I'm like, well, I'm not gonna do that. I have family members, right? But yeah, it's that early bonding period that I missed, I think really has affected her in such a profound way.
Absolutely, absolutely. I know my experience with my son, who's 19, who just recently came back in the home with me full time. He's been there for a little less than 2 months. His experience in school, he had continuously was in trouble, continuously was in exclusionary discipline, continuously just fell through all of the systems, and the school was not a place where he felt safe. It was not a place where he was shown that he was of value or that he believed that he was even a smart kid. He's been with me for less than 2 months and he's already successfully gotten his GED. Nice. I think that indicates the ability that parents have, if given a little bit of support, to be able to stay with their children and in the community with some supportive services. I now make decent money, so I didn't need anybody to help me get my kid gas to get my kid back and forth to school. He didn't have to worry about food to eat. There was not violence occurring in the home. Some of these things occurred when he was little, and when I asked for help from my community, right, those things were weaponized and it was used to remove him from me. What, if any, supportive services in the community do you think could exist to help families stay together, to deter them from family separation, or help with the reunification process?
Wow, that's a great question. First, I would dismantle CPS. That would be the first thing I would do, and just revamp that, because although I didn't deal with CPS, there were a lot of women incarcerated with me that dealt with CPS. If there were more programs for it, okay, say I did a crime and I have to pay for it. All right, fine, I have a kid. Let me serve my time outside, not inside of a prison cell. And the reason why I say that is because, again, it goes back to that bonding, the bonding with the mom and the child. So if there were more programs out in the community where moms can go and serve their time out, or have their children with them, especially if they're under 3 years old, to have their baby with them and not separate them, I think that there will be less problems. I think there will be less prisoner pipeline, because I do believe that is a start, especially, when I look at my kid, Sean, when he was growing up, they wanted to medicate him. He was a problem child, not the fact that he was being raised by my mom His mom is in prison. He's dealing with a lot of emotions. They wanted to medicate him instead of giving him some kind of help. So I do think it's important to keep the moms with the children. And I cannot think off the top of my head where there is a program today that would keep families together instead of sending a mom to prison.
I don't think one exists. And even when women have done their time, I think there are 2 programs in the entire state of Texas where a woman could go with her child. And the stipulation is that the child has to be under 12. So our most vulnerable population of children who are less likely to be adopted, who are less likely to get permanent placement sites, a woman couldn't even take her child there. Although women are at higher rates the primary caretaker of children, although the Black single female has the highest likelihood of being incarcerated right now. She has the lowest likelihood to receive any state, city, or federal funded program.
Imagine if there were programs. A lot of the women are in survival mode, right?
Yeah.
I do believe there is a rise of women incarceration rate. I do believe the reason for this rise is because they don't have the proper resources to help them with their children or to help them get out of a bad situation. CPS is known for family separation instead of giving the resources that that mom need at that particular time to keep her child together, which probably, in fact, would have stopped incarceration in the beginning. There is abuse that she may have dealt with. There may be a situation in the home that she don't know how to get out of. So imagine if we had those resources in place, there will be less women incarcerated and there will be less family separation. So I think our first thing we need to do is to make sure that the women that are in jail now, imagine if we go and talk to these women and give them the resources that they need to help them, they would be sitting in jail right now.
Absolutely. I 100% agree. I 100% agree that we should be giving resources to our families, to our moms. We should be considering their parental status if they do come into contact with the criminal legal system. And we should consider the structural inequities on how folks get there. And we should prioritize putting value back on Black families because they have been dismantled since the inception of us in America, and most certainly we can date back to the war on drugs.
Oh, absolutely. We can go beyond that to like convict leasing and all of that. The prison, in my point of view, was designed to keep Black and brown people in bondage. And through the course of the years, it has not gotten any better for Black and brown bodies. In fact, if you look at the statistic, there's more of us incarcerated without any means or without any resources than there are any other nationality, right? And imagine if those folks had the resources they need, because it goes back to the product of your environment. If you don't have it from the beginning, you're going to do whatever you need to do to survive. And that's maybe hustling. That's maybe going to steal so you can put food on your kid's table. The resources in the Black community is just not there. And I think as a whole, we as society has done the Black and brown community a disservice.
Absolutely, absolutely. One final thought that I have before we wrap up is that we as community members have to wrap around each other. We have to support families. We have to support single moms. We have to support single dads. And we have to rely on each other because I think that the answer is within us and not the systems. Continuing to advocate for resources to be allocated to community-based organizations and services. I think, yes, we absolutely do that, but I also think we build bonds and relationships with each other so that when children are having behavioral health issues, when children or when we're lacking in food insecurity, you can go somewhere where you're not gonna be mandatory reported on and you can get a package of ground meat to make it through the week, where you can get someone to watch your kid because you got to pick up a few extra shifts to keep your lights on. What is one thing that you would leave our audience with as it relates to family separation?
Abolishing these systems is the best way we can go. Society has become complacent with the fact that these systems work. And I'm saying CPS, the criminal justice system. We have come to the belief that they're rehabilitating people, and they're not. They're causing more harm than they're doing good. So I would abolish these systems that we have in place and, again, return that money to community. Actually give people the money, the resources that they need to survive. We wouldn't have these systems if folks had what they needed just to live a daily life. It's really hard to do. And we have to get society to know and come to terms with the fact that we built these systems on the backs of slaves, and it does not work.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining me here today.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me.